tonight's program. The title which Ambassador Hill sent to us was Listening to Iraqis about Iraq's crisis. And being one of those people who thinks the word listening is close to a virtue, I was delighted to see that particular title. And it is important to listen to the Iraqis. And if we have a crisis with respect to Iraq, that nation has a crisis with respect to what's going on today. So the title, I think, is absolutely fascinating. We couldn't have a more distinguished gentleman to approach it and report on it. For 18 months, he's been talking to Iraqi parliamentarians and Iraqi sheikhs, and for him to give a report on that is extraordinary. Ambassador Murphy joined the State Department after receiving bachelor degrees from Harvard and then from Cambridge. Joined in 1955. His early career dealt with involved postings in a number of countries, Zimbabwe first, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia. He was, in the late 60s, responsible for the Arabian Peninsula. And following that, he became ambassador to Mauritania, then ambassador to Syria, then ambassador to the Republic of the Philippines, then ambassador to Saudi Arabia. From that, he became the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and he served in that position from 1983 to 1989. During that period of time, he received 3 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards, 2 State Department Superior Honor Awards. That truly distinguished career, which is a full life for anyone, was followed by a number of years of close involvement in the Middle East, a continuing close involvement. He was a Council of Foreign Relations Fellow starting in '89. He worked with the Council until at least '04. During that time, he was also head of their Middle East study group at the Council on Foreign Relations, and for 8 years within that bracket of time, president of the Middle East Institute. He has served on a number of distinguished, the boards of distinguished organizations, the Virtue Foundation, which should raise your eyebrows. It's dedicated to humanitarian efforts, closely linked to the United Nations. He served on on a board related to the Middle East Foundation, the U.S.-Iranian Committee, and the Interreligious Committee for Peace in the Middle East. Most of you have seen or heard him or read his writings. You've probably seen him on CNN or one of the major TV networks. You may have heard him on public radio. You may have read him in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Financial Times or elsewhere. His distinction is clear. What's even more impressive, perhaps, is that the State Department career was so successful, and the years after it have been followed by very dedicated service and continued interest in the region of the world, which is our topic tonight. It's an enormous pleasure and honor to present Ambassador Richard W. Murphy.
Let's see, that makes 3 glasses of water, which I deeply appreciate, having just come back 2 days ago from Kuwait and Abu Dhabi. You have no idea the wealth that this implies. But thank you, Frank, for that introduction. It's a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to be with you tonight and to be, I guess, your wrap-up speaker for the year. I picked the topic of Iraq, which, given the depth and the range of our involvement, remains the critical foreign policy issue facing our country. Now, I know that you have all been swamped over the past years by a flood of opinions. They've come at you from our officials, civilian officials, from our military, politicians, from commentators of all shapes and sizes, some of whom make more categorical assertions about what is going on in Iraq than their own exposure to that country justifies. But we won't belabor that point. I'm going to discuss what I have learned from my participation in a face-to-face dialogue. It's a group that brought together Iraqi members of parliament and tribal sheikhs. None of them are household names in our country, but they are opinion leaders and men of influence in their own country. They were invited to join a dialogue on the theme of national reconciliation in Iraq with a few of us outside moderators. It was organized in late 2006 by an American non-governmental group, the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, or IISD, which I'll describe to you shortly. Just a word of warning, perhaps. You're going to find my own comments heavier on the progress in our dialogue, what they have been saying, and perhaps with fewer clear-cut predictions about the outcome of the current conflicts in Iraq than you may have expected. But I wanted to share with you and walk you through the way their thinking has developed over the course of our dialogue. And I'll conclude with some personal recommendations, though I may be more tentative than some of the commentators you've been listening to. I'd like to deal with the topic from three angles. First, just to take a brief note of two current and contradictory American analyses of Iraq's future, what I call extreme positions, which frame our national debate. You've heard references to both of these in the questioning at the Congress questioning of Ambassador Crocker, General Petraeus in recent months. Secondly, I'll spend the bulk of my time on the debate within this Iraqi circle. And third, as I say, I'll give my own opinion about how we might improve our dealings with Iraq. Well, first, one current school of thought in our country, call it the not-so-new neocon school, affirms that despite all the criticisms directed at this administration for its decision to invade 5 years ago, and what has been a generally admitted some serious mismanagement of our post-war involvement, don't worry, Iraq is going to be a success story. Iraq is going to become a stable, a democratic state, a model for democratic revolution in the Arab world, perhaps even in the broader Islamic world. There's an eloquent, sophisticated spokesman for that view in Fred Kagan at the American Enterprise Institute. The second, and for me, equally far out, is the one that our commitment to extra troops in last year's surge was too little, was too late, and we have to cut our losses, bring our troops home within the first year at the maximum of the new administration, and then let the Iraqis sort out their own problems. Both of these schools focus on American national interests and show limited awareness of the intensity of Iraqi concerns. First, a word of introduction about the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue. It's a small, non-profit organization based in Washington and Dayton, Ohio. It operates under the auspices of the Kettering Foundation, stated mission is to promote dialogue aimed at transforming and resolving deep-rooted conflicts abroad and on American college campuses. In the latter, it's focused mostly on instances of racial disagreements and conflict on the campuses. Hal Saunders, a predecessor of mine as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Near East and South Asian Affairs in the State Department, is IISD's president. He's a long-term practitioner of sustained dialogue, having himself started as a participant in the Dartmouth Conference, the Soviet-American dialogue between concerned private citizens in our country and Soviets. Its basic formula, its basic approach is simple. Start by selecting representatives for your group from the broadest possible cross-section of factions that are locked into a conflict situation. In Iraq's situation, that is one of daily killings that we're hearing about. Bring your group to a manageable size to allow a real dialogue, not more than 20, 25 people. Then keep that membership as constant as possible so that their shouting, their speech-making and posturing start to subside and the participants gradually ease into an exchange of ideas, how their conflicting interests might be reconciled. When we started, as outside moderators, our lead-off question with the Iraqis was, we have heard that all of you stand for the unity and the integrity of your country. Well, what are you prepared to do to accommodate your adversaries? Beyond killing them, which is one solution. We keep reminding the participants that there are things only governments can do and ways of thinking creatively about handling a crisis that only people who are actively seeking reconciliation can do, and that they have been invited to participate in this group to meet in their personal, not their political capacities. The Institute held its initial meeting in Istanbul in November 2006 with some 30 Iraqis, members of parliament, the advisor to the prime minister was there. And that was designed to get the participants' recommendations about who should be members of a future dialogue if we could get it organized. We explained that it was to serve as a brainstorming space outside of the pressure cooker that is Baghdad, to generate ideas and test proposals for reconciliation. We said, look, this dialogue is not a substitute for what your own government is trying to do. They had a commission already established, but intended to work in parallel with it, and that the established commission has continued, but not very effectively. It was, on our part, working with them to try to identify the components of a grand compromise in Iraq and discuss the obstacles to that compromise. Finally, to design a series of confidence-building measures that could be implemented. We asked the Iraqis whether they believe that an unofficial, sustained dialogue to build a unified, peaceable state in Iraq would be useful. They said yes. They were enthusiastic, and we decided we'll try it. It might be workable. We've since had 4 sessions, 3 days each, spaced out over this past 18 months. 1 was in Jordan and 3 in Beirut. There were 2 complications in getting the group organized. The Institute's normal process is to bring in, as moderators, a small number of Americans, perhaps other outsiders. In this case, we total 5 to work with the contending parties. Now, over the years, the Institute has chosen some far-out problems like the civil war in Tajikistan or the conflict between Azeris and Armenians over in Nagorno-Karabakh. It was simpler dealing with those impossible problems, because we were clearly, as Americans, we were clearly outsiders. With this group, the 3 Americans involved, and we added a retired British diplomat and a representative of an Italian research institute, we couldn't play the role of observer in the corner, prompting with an occasional question. They kept seeking our active participations, a role that we tried to reject, but, you know, America is, what is it, the 500 or the 800-pound gorilla in any room involving Iraq. Well, this group of some 24 was selected for the members' closeness to the leaders of their communities, Shia, Sunni, Kurd. We urged them to try to speak in their personal capacities, but said we assumed they enjoyed enough top-level access in Baghdad to provide their leaders with a frank running account of our meetings. To this initial group of members of parliament, we've added 3 tribal sheikhs, 2 from Al Anbar province and 1 from Diyala. We started as well with 2 exiles from Iraq, 1 from the Ba'ath Party, the former ruling party, and 1 from an affiliate of the Ba'ath who are political refugees in Damascus. Well, we believe that the group over this time has proved to be broadly representative of Iraq's current political complexities. The membership has stayed constant, except for the Ba'athi representative who was told by his party, drop out or die. His associate, understandably nervous at that development, also dropped out. The others have stayed together. They continue to shout at each other, but the dialogue nonetheless has shown progress that I hope to persuade you of. At their second session last November, the group agreed to draw up their own agenda, and that is part of the principle. It's your work, it's your problem, it's your country. Now, come on, what is your agenda that you most want to talk about? They agreed first on affirming a commitment to democracy, to the peaceful exchange of power through elections, the rule of law, and, somewhat surprisingly, to federalism. I say surprising because federalism has no real roots in Arab history. The only example of it today is in the United Arab Emirates, where the poor sheikhs some 40 years ago on the east coast of the Arabian Peninsula agreed in the 1960s to delegate some of their authority to the wealthy and famously generous ruler of Abu Dhabi. Well, in any case, when I say they supported federalism, it was a highly qualified form, and to quote from their statement at the end of the meeting, it was to be one form of government provided it is not organized on a confessional or ethnic basis, that is, neither Sunni, Shia, or Kurd. And provided also that the establishment of regions, governing districts, would be based on the wishes of their inhabitants and in a democratic manner. The Ba'athi representative, who was still with us in that session, said that, look, no, any implementation of federalism, any new ideas about how to divide the country into different voting districts should take place only after the withdrawal of all foreign forces. In the earlier give and take of those sessions, he opposed any planning for government reorganization until American troops had pulled out. Clearly, he envisioned, along with his colleagues in the Ba'ath Party, that once we were gone, that party would sweep back into power and reestablish itself as the one running Iraq. Well, the final statement on that second session agreed only on the need to withdraw foreign forces on a timetable in accordance with building up Iraq's armed forces and security apparatus on a professional and national basis. The participants also agreed that the agenda of their sessions should deal with constitutional amendments and legal reforms, including the legislative changes required by the national reconciliation process. They agreed to activate a program of what they call transitional justice, which would deal not only with the cases of those victims of Saddam Hussein's regime, but those victims of the near civil war that has plagued Iraq ever since Saddam was overthrown. What position the government should take towards armed factions and militias was on the agenda, and as well on the nature of the long-term relationship between Iraq and American forces. By the end of the third session last January, the members of the group had gained self-confidence. They had begun to talk of themselves as, hey, we might have, as members of Parliament, we might be members of something which could have an impact. They issued their first public statement. It was brief, general, but it got play in the regional press. It spoke of the need for confidence-building measures and asserted that a democratic federal system was the choice of the Iraqi people. That part of the statement was possible only because the Ba'athi had disappeared. And he has yet to be replaced by his party. The group formed a committee to work on a framework for national reconciliation in Iraq. That was a tangible step. They, as members of the parliament, were going to get together and draw up the legislation and the budget for this national committee to be operating outside of the parliament. Well, this draft framework was adopted unanimously by all of them, and the Commission for National Reconciliation, they got very excited about, would oversee the process both at the central government level and the provincial levels. One of our participants, a jurist by training, is developing a draft law to establish the commission, and 10 of our participants will, all themselves legislators, will co-sponsor the law. So what have we learned? First, there's no quick fix to any of the problems afflicting Iraq today. 5 years ago, when we invaded that country, we invaded a country which at that time we knew less about than we did about any major Arab country. You know, it was a period from 1967 till 2003, to the invasion. In all of those years, we had a functioning embassy in Iraq for only 6 years, and that was in the 1980s. There were no commercial, political, intelligence, military attaches going around the country. And even when we were there, we were operating in an environment where the leader, Saddam, had very clear instructions out to his officials, and the message went out to all of his people: you don't talk to foreigners. Or something unpleasant might happen, would happen. Well, we came into Iraq, and as the dust began to settle, we pushed for early elections, aware that the numerical dominance of the Shia population in Iraq would bring about a reversal of 1,400 years of Sunni Arab rule. One vote, one man. Invading Iraq, the administration chose to ignore the words of warning attributed to Colin Powell, comparing Washington to the customer at Pottery Barn who fails to read the sign: you break it, you own it. Our second lesson was how commonly most Iraqis appear to view the United States as the source of all their problems. True or not, it's going in a curious way, it just might be a way to pull them together as a people over the years to come. But they resent that their political development is being driven by an American agenda and specifically by an American political calendar. They strongly criticize the fact that our troops, and particularly our security companies, have not been accountable to Iraqi tribunals. That said, the participants have been, and still are, ambivalent about the American role. Most of them welcome American pressure exerted through the embassies, directly from Washington, on the Iraqi government if it's for reforms to improve public security, if it's for securing amendments to their constitution and to block what some term an Iranian invasion. At other times, its members warn that we and all other outsiders should keep our noses out of Iraq's internal affairs. Most surprisingly to me, they lament the lack of a basic American commitment to train and arm the regular Iraqi armed forces ever since we dissolved the army back in 2003. Sweeping criticisms of American policy dominated those first two sessions. They seemed to diminish by the third, certainly by the fourth, as the participants' internal differences began to emerge and be spoken about with greater frankness. There is still, or I would call it their most frequent charge, that Washington decided in the immediate aftermath of the war to organize the first governing council so quickly and by one vote, one man, how many Shia you got, how many Kurds, how many Sunni, that this resulted in fanning the flames of sectarianism. They assert this fostered the emergence of the sectarian militias, the suicide bombers, which have ever since made life hell in the streets of Baghdad and throughout the country, excepting the situation in Kurdistan. Their constant refrain has been, for all his faults, Saddam ran a secular regime. Our tribes always contained a mixture of the two main sects. Our citizens, particularly in Baghdad and the urban centers, intermarried without much thought about it. Who did the husband or the wife come from? Were they Shia or were they Sunni? The senior sheikhs of our tribes were always able to reconcile the differences and minimize sectarian feelings. But you Americans created sectarianism as a way to divide us as a people and as a prelude to partitioning our country. That's your secret plan, let's be honest. Their idea of our secret plan. The Iraqis insist that in earlier days no one distinguished between fellow citizens based on their being Shia, Sunni, Arab, or Kurdish. They acknowledged that Saddam would ruthlessly crush individuals and groups, but they were those whom he suspected of opposing his regime. And in the next breath, they gave him credit for preserving public order. Of course, some of those wounds on the Iraqi body politic are ancient ones. They were inflicted in the very early days of Islam. Bitter memories among the Shia of the martyrdom of their leaders at the hands of Sunnis as the two groups began to shape up as distinct are kept alive in the annual rituals of Shiism. I think, nonetheless, we have to be honest and accept the fact that the speed, the violence of our invasion, followed by our pressures which we intended to quickly restore a functioning government, all of these coming together, ripped the scabs off the older wounds, and they're bleeding. They recall how they heard from some in Washington who had been the most fervent advocates of overthrowing Saddam, that they had dwelt on the plight of the Shia. As I say, none of the Iraqis that we've been talking to directly praise Saddam, but they argue that he had not consistently favored the Sunni over the Shia and over the Kurds. They commented that some of his closest henchmen, those whose pictures were on those 52 playing cards our troops distributed right after the invasion, over half of those were Shiite, his closest close advisors. Saddam favored those who steadily proved their loyalty. Those whom he suspected were routinely arrested and often liquidated. The others lived in awareness that there were clear red lines which you didn't cross unless you wanted to come to the attention of the leader and his security forces. I would note that the Kurdish participants were notably quiet during that part of the discussion. The Kurds had early on asserted that their main red line was that it had to be a federal arrangement. They would never return to a political structure which put their people under the control of Baghdad's military and police forces, no matter what overall form of government finally emerged. A third lesson has been the prevailing Iraqi assumption that we have absolutely no intention to withdraw our forces. You've heard a lot in recent weeks about negotiations between Washington and Baghdad aimed at reaching a security agreement governing the relationship after the UN mandate expires this December. There are still several important differences between the two sides. I doubt that the administration will, by the end of July, which is its target, reach that agreement, but we'll see. But one participant noted, look, you invaded our country for 3 reasons. To dominate our oil industry, and you saw something in today's press on that score, to protect Israel, and to maintain a major military presence so you could assure your overall control of this region. That brought you here, and that's going to keep you here. Those are the reasons you're going to stay. To respond that the oil world today is governed by market forces, not foreign concessions, to remind them that Israel was always far more concerned about Iran than about Iraq, and that they need only listen to our presidential candidates debate whether to set a date for our troop withdrawal, has not changed their assumption that we intend to stay. In reply, they would say things like, well, look at Hunt Oil of Texas. Chairman is a close friend, a supporter of President Bush. Now, in defiance of our national law, he signed an agreement to explore for oil in Kurdistan with the Kurdish oil minister in defiance of the national minister. On our military intentions, well, if you don't intend to stay, why are you continuing to build these major military bases in our country? As for Israel, their conviction has been unshakable that our concern for Israeli interests dictates every aspect of American Near East policy. Well, at this point, you're bound to be asking, so what have we heard that's encouraging? Well, as I say, first, that as far as the group itself is concerned, the participants who are members of the Parliament are beginning to feel their oats. They, in effect, were appointed by their various political factions to be the candidates. And when they started, they had a habit of criticizing the government, meaning President, Prime Minister, and the cabinet ministers, and the political elite, as if these were somehow invaders from outer space. Now they a little abashedly admit that they are part of the political elite and have begun to think in terms of contributing to national reconciliation. They're expressing an increased level of what I would call professionalism in the way they both frame the issues and solutions for dealing with them. Issue-based politics is growing, and confessional politics are somewhat less of a driver in the parliamentary bloc behavior. Second, encouraging, their sense of having a common Iraqi identity may be weak, but it exists. And plainly, they need time to strengthen it. They caution us Iraq is a complicated society, and we should prepare the ground carefully for any policy changes we intend to make. A Kurdish member summed it up neatly when he said in front of the entire group, we Kurds need to work to convince the Shia and the Sunni that when we sign separate oil deals, this doesn't mean we want to establish a separate state. You Sunni have to learn and persuade us that you have learned among the Kurdish population and the Shia that you realize you will never again have the former monopoly of political power, but that you will be important partners. And you Shia have to learn that you cannot rule Iraq by yourselves. This prompted a Shia member to add that, and we Shia must make plain we're not just instruments of Iranian power. Well, it was a nice statement. These are sound goals, but it's a long way from being realized. None of the three communities see the others as having recognized their special fears and their rights. None are satisfied with the current state of affairs in Iraq, and they're nervous about how it might develop. There are some facts out there. The new Iraqi flag is still not flown widely in the Kurdish region. It's not on display in certain of the Sunni Arab communities. When the Kurdish members of the group were not able to attend the last session because of the closure of the airport in Baghdad, this gave free hand to the Sunnis and the Shia present to talk about Kurdish greed and lack of a national spirit. They derided the Kurds as having a separate identity, saying, oh, of all the so-called Kurds, maybe 5% were Kurdish, and the rest were all Arabs in their origin. The Kurdish leaders, Talabani, Barzani, covered this up to convince you Americans that they needed special and favored treatment. We can observe them, their social interaction at mealtimes, the Shia at daggers drawn with each other, divided between the Supreme Council of Shia and the Sadris. They would all sit together by preference to eat their meals, separate from the Kurds and the Sunni. And the Sunni speak openly of all Shia as being Iranians or Persians, depending on how mean you want to be at that particular point, even while acknowledging that they had fought side by side with their Sunni compatriots in the Iran-Iraq war for 8 years in the 1980s. Members of the group have begun to say they can find ways to work together, but it's unclear to us how binding this is going to prove to be on the national scene. And obviously our effort only has value if it creates a broader ripple effect. We do have playback from Talabani, from the Prime Minister Maliki approving the effort. We brief Washington and after each session, and we've begun to brief diplomatic representatives of Iraq's neighbors in Jordan, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. All have said keep going. None have disagreed with us except for the Iranian who said you never should have invited Ba'athis in the first place. Third, at our last meeting, the group started talking about the fears and apprehensions that each have and what kind of assurances they want and can give. Well, there's still a long road ahead, and I said at the outset that I would share a few thoughts about the future and recommendations of American involvement. I think some misinterpretations of what we want and where we're heading, we can deal with unilaterally. For instance, we could stop military base construction. But in just saying this, I know the Pentagon's allergy to having to affirm that it will never want bases in any country. It just doesn't like to say that, and I don't think they ever have. Second, we should recognize the limits of our ability to negotiate a status of forces agreement in a country renowned for its distaste of foreign occupation. We have to find a balance between what we demand in commitments from the Iraqi side and what immunities we seek for Americans. If this agreement is published and is reached, first of all, it will be published, and as a sign of how sensitive not just Iraq but the whole region is, this will be the first unclassified status of forces agreement ever to be reached. All of them have had one or more degrees of confidentiality. Sectarian divisions they're going to remain a reality, threatening recurrent and serious communal violence. A good deal of time will be needed before these wounds start to heal over again. Most of Iraq's current political parties exploit a sectarian identity. Our group is keenly aware of the danger that their country could slide into what they call Lebanization. They urge us not to push them in that direction, and in framing our recommendations to Iraq, we should remain sensitive to these fears, even when it comes down to the timing of the elections ahead. Beyond that, it's tough to recommend how best to handle our future dealings. I have, 4 suggestions. First, take it as a given that whoever leads Iraq in the future, over the longer run, is going to have to have been a declared and an open opponent of us at some point. All of them who have served in the most senior posts since the invasion have been tarred by their critics as our stooges. And the corollary of this is that conspiracy theories about our role in Iraq will long prevail no matter what we do or with whomever we negotiate. We just have to understand that, live with it. Second, all Iraqis believe that they are paying for America having made Iraq the arena for fighting terrorism. This, they say, look, that's a regional problem, it's an international problem, and not just Iraqi. You have a major responsibility to help us deal with that issue. Well, that attitude has created an opportunity which we have exploited. A U.S. partnership with some Sunni, with a few Shia, in the so-called awakening movement to oppose al-Qaeda in Iraq. We can continue to build on this positive atmosphere, but be aware of appearing to favor any community over the other. In other words, they want us out, but not before we've helped mend a lot of broken crockery. Third, they show a striking deference to their tribal sheikhs. They say, look, the sheikhs are right when they say that we politicians have played sectarian politics, and they are concerned about the welfare and the bloodshed between fellow tribesmen. They want to save all their people. We need to better understand the role of the tribal leaders in that country. Fourth, how do we deal with the charge that, strange as it seems, that the widespread influence of Iran today in Iraq was at least facilitated by American policy, and that we probably deliberately planned it. That attitude we can and we have to counter. And I think the most effective way to do that, and one which will unnerve a lot of Iraqis, is actually to develop a better U.S.-Iranian relationship. This is not going to be easy. We haven't had a civil dialogue with Iran since 1979 in the revolution. But one of our most urgent tasks is to find the way to open that dialogue. Its role as a neighbor and a regional power demands it. Many Iraqis deeply distrust Iranian intentions. but also they don't want to be an American proxy caught up in American-Iranian disagreements. Well, this last leads me to urge that our government spare no effort to involve all the neighbors of Iraq in helping reconstruct that country. Its stability is indeed fragile. Its failure as a state will damage the whole region. There have been steps recently. The UAE decided to appoint an ambassador to open an embassy in Baghdad. That's a good move. The United Nations mission in Baghdad has a vital role to play in helping organize and monitor the upcoming provincial elections so that they're viewed as free and fair by as many as possible, because this is a test for re-engaging large and marginalized segments of the Iraqi population in the political process. So in conclusion, I don't bring you tonight a magic solution to Iraq's problems and to our involvement therein. My exposure to this dialogue, to this crossfire of Iraqi politicians, has convinced me we simply cannot handle the situation on our own. As I listened hour after hour to them discuss their problems, I would occasionally fantasize that if only our administration, in planning to overthrow Saddam, had read about some of the problems the British experienced back in the 1920s, we might never have invaded that country. But short of that, every official pre-war planning document in Washington should have carried at its top Kipling's reminder, and I quote something you probably all know by heart: "At the end of the fight is a tombstone white with the name of the late deceased, and the epitaph drear, a fool lies here who tried to hustle the East." Thank you. Please.
We're deeply appreciative. The floor is open for questions. Yes, sir. In the hypothetical situation that we attack Iran, how would the Shia behave?
Well, let me first say, if we decide that, I think it would be a terrible mistake, because I think it would bring together not only the Iranian people behind a leader who many of them despair of, but it would totally unnerve our friends in the area, particularly in the smaller Gulf states, who see that, or foresee that they would become the targets of Iranian retaliation if there was a clear attack on, well, say their nuclear program or other targets in Iran. And I don't know, I don't really mind paying $4.05 a gallon, but I don't want to pay $8. And that's something you've got to reckon with. The Straits of Hormuz can be closed or can be made much more dangerous. And commercial shipping is, as has been said, a coward. They're not about to, in the name of just getting that carload of oil, that shipload of oil out, brave what missiles and all the Iranians can target them with. The Shia themselves, anyway, just a quick answer on that. The Shia themselves in Iraq, I think most of them see themselves as Iraqi. They are Arab. They speak Arabic. They came after Khomeini came to power in Iran to think increasingly of Iran and the holy city of Qom in Iran as the center of their direction of where the direction of their faith should go for new directions. But they remain Arab, and I wouldn't. It could certainly stir up civil strife within Iraq, but so can many other things.
Would you comment on the facets of the huge refugee problem?
As it regards Syria, yeah, 2 million Iraqis on top of an economy which is far from sturdy and flourishing, given the way their government has devised its economic policies over the years in Syria. It's a terrific burden. For several months, the Syrians had an open door. You could come in without a visa. They just said, "Welcome. You're in distress." They haven't been able to keep to that. I think they've now demanded a visa to come into the country. And there's pressure in terms of the kids attending Syrian schools, in terms of lawful employment. There are real pressures to, go home, just go home. I think we have to applaud them for what they did in that period of terrific need of the refugees, who were terrified about what was happening to them. They had lost family members all over the country. Their homes were occupied as there was sort of ethnic cleansing within the country by a rival community, and they fled. Things have calmed down a bit, but they're not certainly all reassured that it's going to be a continuing calming atmosphere, calming down in their own country. How we would feel if we had several 100,000. Well, how do you feel about all those Mexicans coming in? So, we're not immune to reacting with to a major influx, and this is a major influx. The Jordanians the same. It's not just the Syrians. On Syrian-American relations, I think we have erred for a number of years in treating Syria as not as a world power, but as a major threat to American interests, and followed a policy that they know what we want. They know what they have to do. We don't need to tell them about it face to face. We don't need to talk to them. Well, that's nonsense. They've got their pride and they've got their history, and they want to have an American ambassador in Damascus that they haven't had since the Hariri assassination in, 4 years ago now in Lebanon. And they would like to engage. It's been a downright embarrassment that the Israelis want to talk to the Syrians. And we're in this odd position where the Israelis, through the Turks, are talking to the Syrians. The Israelis, through the Egyptians, are talking to Hamas. These are unspeakably evil forces that should be ignored and never met with. Well, occasionally some good things come out of diplomacy. Not always.
The question is, would other settlements perhaps accelerate the solutions in Iraq, or is this purely an Iraqi problem?
Look, you're asking somebody who's talked for some years of the core problem in the area being Arab Israel and the need to expand beyond Egyptian-Israeli agreements to Syrian, Jordanian, Lebanese, well, the Jordanians did with their peace treaty, and the sort of acceptance in the area that, surprisingly, it was the Saudis who launched the idea that you get yourself back to the 67 lines and work out a reasonable solution on the Palestinians and refugees, then you'll be accepted by the entire Arab world. It's a shame that we ignored that in the early years, and the Israelis laughed at it in the early years. Both of us have come around a bit. In Iraq, in the period I was visiting Iraq and dealing with the authorities in the 80s, their fixation was the Iran-Iraq war, not the Palestinian cause. They gave that rhetorical support. When Desert Storm happened in '91, that was after my period in the office, Saddam launched missiles, you remember, at Israeli targets. Very relatively crude missiles that didn't appear to have been targeted to any particular site in Israel, but a terror weapon. It never, I felt, was his prime concern. He had enough to worry about with the Iranians than with our invasion, which he apparently was to the end, thinking it wasn't going to happen. And as his Minister of Information said, the day we arrived in Baghdad, they weren't anywhere near those foreigners. But I do think that if this administration succeeds, you're not seeing them have much time to succeed. You've got a limited number of months now, and you have the odd situation of trying to bring together to make an extremely difficult agreement, even on principle, of weak leadership in Israel and weak leadership of the Palestinians. It defies common sense to talk of an agreement, but hey, whoever applied common sense to the Middle East has been disappointed often. Something may happen. It's odd that we have talked it up as a certainty that something big would happen by the end of this year. The Israeli settlers are not about to change their stripes. The Palestinian nationalists who want it all back aren't about to change, at least by the end of December. Now there's a prospect of a truce. A calming down, I think, is the Israeli word for it, or the Arab word that they've accepted to describe the Hamas-Israeli agreement. Well, that's what the region needs, and that's what the Palestinians and Israelis need, above all, is a calming down so that maybe something positive can come out of it. Once upon a time, Israel rejected anything that was not everlasting peace. I don't think they talk that way now, but they still can't embrace I guess it was Arafat talked about a 10-year truce. That they regarded as a trick, as a game to put them off balance and allow the Palestinians to grow stronger and more ambitious. More and more Israelis appear to be thinking in terms of finding a way to build on this small opening that the Egyptians have helped create between Hamas and Israel. And we wish them well, but it's a leap from there to get to the sort of agreement that the administration at least has talked about.
Well, recognizing the principle that discussions such as those take a long time to work out the wisdom beneath them, and that setting deadlines is often crude and unsatisfactory, I have the job of saying it's time for us to end this session.
Thank you very much.
This has been an extraordinary evening. We're very much in the ambassador's